In our second session, we have a discussion on history, narratives, and research. We invite on stage Disha Ahluwalia, field archaeologist and PhD research scholar at MSU Baroda. Prasenjit Basu, economist, author of Asia Reborn. Vijayalakshmi Vijaykumar, author and director, Center for Soft Power, Indica, and contributing moderator, Nandini Sengupta, journalist and author.
Good morning and namaskar to everybody. We are here to discuss something that causes a lot of Twitter wars and other social media discussions off and on, which is about narratives in history. In the last 10 odd years or so, we have seen history and the telling of history change appreciably. Before that, there was a certain set narrative which was not only expounded by scholars abroad, but was dittoed word for word by scholars in India. What has happened, and I can say this, speak for myself as well, is that the democratization of history has opened the door to people who are not necessarily historians, but are willing to read history for fun and look at history as a story worth telling, rather than as an ideological dogma that needs to be expounded. So today in our discussion, we have some lovely panelists over here who have done amazing work with history, and we're going to talk a little bit about how each of us have tried to look at history with a different lens. I'm going to start off with Disha, because we are all here to talk about the horse and how the horse has, one animal has skewed an entire, maybe couple of generations idea of the Indian past. Disha has been working on Rakhigari, and she's one of our finest and brightest young archaeologists. So I'm going to ask Disha, can you as an archaeologist give us solid evidence-based explanation of how the way we look at India's ancient past has changed following the digs that have happened?
So, the beginning of archaeological research is when it started in 1800s. The scenario was, am I audible? Yeah. So the scenario was totally different. The idea of past was linked to antiquities, and there was this race to find the antiquities and to dig up only for antiquities, right? And with 1947 and 1951-52, when Archaeological Survey of India in a newly formed country was resurrected, right? The idea was no longer to find antiquities, but to find the past, archaeological past of a newly formed country. Because remember, Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, and many major sites, which in 1920-21 have pushed the dates of Indian subcontinent to 3rd millennium BCE. It was a time when in the newly, the political boundary that has changed has sort of left a gap. And there was a gap in archaeological research. So there were many, projects that were funded by government back then, which explored areas which were not explored earlier. And many sites were dotted. Like if you see the early research, there were new sites that were mapped out across the subcontinent, be it the Paleolithic or the Stone Age sites, or be it the first urbanization or the Harappan sites of Harappan civilization, or the second civilization. With many projects funded, there were new cultures that came about, like painted greyware, which was, according to Professor Lal, it was then linked to Mahabharata. And then NBPW, many cultures were named after pottery because that was the only, solid, conclusive evidence that was found back then. But today, with new technology, with more precision and scientific dating, the C14 dating and other forms of dating. It's not just C14. We have luminescence dating as well. We have dates that are going back. Like, for instance, there's a site in Tamil Nadu called Athirapakkam, which is a Paleolithic site which is dated to 1.7 million years. A couple of decades ago, I don't think it would have been possible to date stone tools. You can date carbon, but with stone at sites, you can't find carbon because most of the sites are not necessarily in their primary context. They are in the secondary context. So dating a stone tool is actually a very challenging job. And kudos to the team, they were able to date it to 1.7 million, which is a very amazing date. Now we can say that the low Paleolithic in India was dated to 1.7, right? And then coming to the later dates, like for instance the dates from Birana, which dates to about about 7th millennium BCE, contemporary to Mehergarh. It brought out a very interesting question, because a Mehergarh, for those who don't know, is a site now in Balochistan. It is a site which gives a complete evolution of culture, not just chronology, right from Neolithic, which is the early farming stage, all the way to the onset of first urbanization in the subcontinent. So it is an index site for sorts for archaeologists for decades. So I have seen literature, even my seniors, they would often go to, they would compare with Neolithic culture 1B. They would find an artifact and they'll be like, this is found in Mehergarh Neolithic period 1B, 1A. But you can see a transition. Now we have sites in India as well which are equally as early. Like for instance, Birana is contemporary to Mehergarh now. We have sites within the Ghaggar Hakra or the Saraswati river system which are also dated quite early. Even Rakhigarhi also, it was thought that earlier, in the absence of C14, the tentative date of Rakhigarhi was about 3,200 or 3,300. But now with the new dates, we know that at least the first settlement, the first settlers, was dated to about 5th millennium or 6th millennium BCE, which is about 5,000 BCE. So we have dates with that. And recently I published a column on print on a site called Alamgirpur, which is on the banks of Yamuna, which is considered to be, or was considered to be, the easternmost site of the Harappan civilization. It was said that from the core to periphery that the migration has happened eastward. Like the large part happened, the migration happened eastward towards Ganga, and Alamgirpur was the last site which sort of resonates with the Harappan culture. But today we have dates of Alamgirpur and sites like Hullas, which does not fall in late Harappan bracket at all, which falls very much into mature Harappan. And there is also thing that was noted, that there was connection. Like for instance, our excavation at Sonali also, with the chariots and everything, we found that there is a communication and contact with the Harappans of the OCP or the local culture, the Chalcolithic or copper using culture.
Can you just, because the audience may not know the reference, so just explain the importance of the chariot. Very important.
Chariots, yeah. So the Sonali is a site in Bagpur district in Ganga Yamuna Dwab. It was first excavated, or actually accidentally discovered, in 2004-2005. It was then excavated in 2005-2006 for over it was a year-long excavation, and about 116 burials were found. But in the absence of, again, proper C14 dating and other gaps in the knowledge system, archaeological data, it was labeled as a late Harappan necropolis. And it was considered to be the largest. It is actually the largest so far that has been found in the northern Indian context. And we decided, the Archaeological Survey of India, Dr. S.K. Manjul, he headed the excavation. And our entire team, while we were excavating another site, which is in the Ganga Yamuna Dwap called Barnawa, we were excavating the site. We decided to re-excavate a trench at Sanoli, and we stumbled upon, multiple chariots, 3 chariots to be precise. They were found in burial pits along with coffins, and these were the legged coffins. And the chariots and the coffins we were able to identify them because of the copper encasing, because the wood is decomposed. So it's very difficult to find traces of wood, especially in our the condition, the temperate conditions. So the copper sort of saved the day, and thank God for copper. We found 3 chariots, and they were not carts, chariots.
Just for the audience, just to explain that for the longest time, we were fed this myth about, blonde, blue-eyed outsiders swooping down into India, riding on their horses, taking over, territories, banishing the dark-skinned people. That is BS. Pardon my language. And the discovery that Disha and her team and Dr. Manjul and others have done is path-breaking, because it shows how the narrative can change with actual archaeological evidence.
And not only chariots, weaponry also. So in Harappan context, usually we don't find weapons. We find agriculture tools, or, more or less we would find an axe. But a weapon like a hilted sword and a dagger and a shield is not found. So at Sanoli, in a proper archaeological context, not just a random, a discovery. It was in burials, in proper archaeological stratified context, we found everything along with chariots.
Thank you, Disha. I'm going to come back to you for more narrative changes. But at this point, I want to talk a little bit about how I came across a narrative change when I was researching for my book on Rani Durgavati. One of the things, if you go to Wikipedia, which is arguably the worst source for any research, you will find that Rani Durgavati is peremptorily dismissed as a tribal queen who was defeated by the great Mughal Akbar. But the reality of that is very, very different and far more nuanced than any Wikipedia stub will tell you. And at this point, I just want to show you how the narrative can change if you look at primary sources a little bit differently. For the longest time, if you ask obviously historians will have a different take on this, but for the man on the street, Mughal Emperor Akbar is Akbar the Great. And he is Akbar the Great for a reason, because he is a very unusual medieval monarch. He is tolerant. He has that whole Sulikul journey where he is interested in other religions, and he incorporates Rajputs into his administration, which is unusual for a Muslim medieval monarch, and so on and so forth. When we start researching and looking at Rani Durgavati's life, we find that this is both right and wrong. Rani Durgavati was killed in a final battle with Akbar's general Asaf Khan in 1564. Akbar's Sulikul journey began a good 15 or 16 years later. The early Akbar, which many of our history books forget to tell us, was a very different human being. Very, very different. Far less tolerant, far more insecure, and far more interested in sort of balancing the Sunni orthodoxy in his court with occasional carrots to the Rajput aristocracy. And that's why I'm going to just give you 1 or 2 examples of how this panned out. In 1564, Akbar abolishes jizya, the tax on non-Muslims. But in 1564, he also encourages and allows, green signals, one of his senior most generals to go and attack Rani Durgavati's kingdom, Garha Mandla or Garha Katanga, which was one of the largest Hindu kingdoms in India at that time. And then he follows it up 3 years later with one of his most brutal campaigns, which is against Chittor. Obviously, there are political expediencies, and he had to take on the Sisodias, but we're going to leave that aside. for the moment. And if you read Akbar's Fatnamas from that time, they are very much, I am a Ghazi, I am doing this against the infidels, I am taking on the idol worshippers and so on. So he was doing this as a signal to the Sunni orthodoxy in his own court. Following which we see the rise of somebody like Sheikh Abdul Nabi, who was a very, very strong figure who kind of almost replaced what Bayram Khan was in the early years of Akbar's life. And peculiarly enough, 10 years after the jizya was abolished, it comes right back. So it comes back in 1574. 1564 it is abolished. 1574 it comes back. Meanwhile, the carrots to the Rajputs dries up after the Battle of Chittor because the Rajput nobility more or less fell in step. And therefore, there was no real need to appease them. So we have to look at the early Akbar's carrot and stick policy as primarily a political agenda. He was doing this tactically to keep both the Sunni orthodoxy as well as the Rajput aristocracy in place, and was throwing little bits of carrots here and there to keep everybody happy. It is only after Sheikh Abdul Nabi is booted out of his court in 1579 and the Sulhi-Kul journey begins that the jizya is abolished good and proper. So we have to look at this tolerance of Akbar with a little bit of nuance than our history books have allowed us so far. It is also important to remember that a lot of Hindu kingdoms also practiced similar tolerance. I mean, Durgavati for herself, for instance, had a whole bunch of Miana Afghan generals under her command, most of whom lost their lives fighting for her. So it's not that Akbar was the only unusual medieval monarch in his day. There were many others. It's just that our narratives have focused the spotlight exclusively on one man. At this point, I'm going to go to Prasenjit because he will give us a slice of history from the similar period. Prasenjit, can you tell us about the demonizing of the Marathas that has happened and how that was also part of a narrative, a colonial narrative that kind of continued way past the colonial, age in our country?
Actually, on Akbar, his most famed wife, who's erroneously called Jodhabai, actually Harkabai, she was called Maryam-uz-Zamani, actually, in the court, and she was buried. She was not cremated. Among her many works, one was to build a grand mosque in Lahore. So, the mythology sometimes overtakes the reality. Anyway, but she, by the way, was also a remarkable trader and entrepreneur. So she created the first state trading corporation. Anyway, but coming to the Marathas, in R.C. Majumdar's magisterial 11-volume History and Culture of the Indian People, Volume 8 is called the Maratha Supremacy. And yet, by the time I studied history in school and a little bit in college, the Marathas had been written out of Indian history. In fact, apparently in the current NCERT textbook, there is one photograph of Shivaji and not even a proper not even a paragraph. Shivaji was just the start, but throughout, essentially there was a period from 1700 until 1818 when the Marathas became the dominant force in India. And for most of the 18th century, about 2/3 of India was ruled by the Marathas. There's a very interesting quote in William Dalrymple's The Anarchy, where he quotes a French traveler in India around the 1750s, who says that the parts of India that are ruled by the Marathas are characterized by the rulers being quite poor, but the people being rich and wealthy, because they promoted commerce and had a low tax regime. Whereas the parts of India that were ruled by the British, the government was rich, the people were poor, because the taxation regime was a continuation of the Mughal era. So now, this is the exact opposite of what we are told. What we are told is that the Marathas were these marauders. All they did was destroy, they didn't build, which is utter nonsense. Now, we also know almost nothing about, for instance, Tarabai. No, Aurangzeb, in his overreach, in the last 25 years of his reign, was spent fighting the Marathas and seeking to dominate the Deccan. And by 1705, Aurangzeb declared defeat. He lamented that he has spent the last quarter century trying to defeat and win over the Deccan, and he has failed. Why did he fail? He failed because of this remarkable Maratha queen, Tarabai, who was 20 years old in 1700 when she became the regent of the Maratha Empire. And she not only provided remarkable administration in the Maratha realms, but she fought battles, she led the troops, and she suffered some defeats, but she also won many victories, and many battles were drawn. They were tied. But the point is, at the end of it, Aurangzeb was defeated. Hardly any of us know anything about Tarabai. There's an Amar Chitra Katha comic which is about it. And she's forgotten even by the Marathas. I mean, even the Marathas talk about, when you read about the story of Tarabai, it is as if the 4 generals who worked for her were really responsible. But she was the one providing leadership. And so that story really still needs to be retold. Then, of course, there was Balaji Vishwanath, who conquered Delhi in 1719. 1718, and Farrukhsiyar, the Mughal emperor, was blinded and imprisoned. Now, do we know about Balaji Vishwanath? Do we know about the great navy? The first modern Indian navy was created by Shivaji and was taken to new heights by an admiral of the Marathas called Kanhoji Angre. And in 1721, you see, now the British wrote about him as this great pirate. Pirate? He was the Maratha admiral. The pirates were the British. So we receive all this British written history. They were the pirates. The piracy took on many forms, including one of Mariam-uz-Zamani's ships, which outlasted her. It was called the Ganji-Savai. It was, it was subject to a piratical event led by a Britisher, I think, called Bridgman. So the pirate were the British. Anyway, now, Kanhoji Angre's story is not known, but in 1721, the British East India Company called for reinforcements, called for the Royal Navy to come and try and sink Kanhoji Angre's fleet off the coast of what is today Bombay or Mumbai. He had several forts along the coast, Alibag and so on. And this great fleet arrived, led by a British Commodore, Foote, and the entire fleet, the British as well as the Portuguese fleet, was sunk by Kanhoji Angre. So, when I talk about, when I talked about the Second World War in my book, and I said, the Japanese, soon after Pearl Harbor, the 2 of the greatest British naval ships in Asia were sunk around the 9th or 10th of December 1941. That was the first Japanese major sinking of a British naval fleet since Kanhoji Angre's time. But Kanhoji Angre is long forgotten. Apparently there is actually an INS Angre in the Indian Navy. Thank goodness, at least a little bit of a memory remains. Now, so that story is not known. We don't know much about Baji Rao. Now, Baji Rao, for 20 years, he fought numerous battles and was never defeated. He fought the Mughals 3 times and won each time by a considerable margin. And the last time, he actually came and took Delhi. So, he is not known. But his cavalry tactics were emulated by an American general in the American Civil War. 140 years after Baji Rao had used those cavalry tactics, they were used by William Tecumseh Sherman in the U.S. Civil War. And this is talked about by Montgomery, in his book about strategy, military strategy. Montgomery basically devotes almost an entire chapter to Baji Rao. But we barely know the name Baji Rao except that foolish movie about his love affair with Mastani. It's kind of true story, by the way. But Mastani was the daughter of Chhatrasal, another person who we don't know much about. Chhatrasal. So there you go. I mean, there is. So then there was Baji Rao, then Balaji Baji Rao, and the entire 18th century has been written out of Indian history. Now, this is very convenient for the British because most British historians acknowledge that the British took India from the Marathas, not the Mughals. The Mughal Emperor Shah Alam was a vassal of one of the Maratha generals, Mahatji Scindia. And Mahatji Scindia wasn't the most important general. Mahatji Scindia reported into the Peshwa in Pune. But nonetheless, he reinstalled Shah Alam on the throne. It was a nominal reinstallation. And he was named a regent plenipotentiary. Mahatji Scindia was regent plenipotentiary of the Mughal Empire. We know nothing about Mahatji Scindia. I mean, we know very little. So all this has to be re-excavated. But all we needed to do was read volume 8 of R.C. Majumdar's book. Now, what happened to R.C. Majumdar's book? This 11-volume work was written primarily to re-establish that India had a history. So, when around 1977, I bought a book called The Concise History of India as my prize book in school. And about 2/3 of it was about the British period and thereafter. The British period is a small period in Indian history. From 1818 to 1940, 129 years, the British were the paramount power in India. The paramount power in India prior to that, for 144 years, were the Marathas. And if you look at the Mughal period, it was barely 150 years or so, 151 years between the time that Akbar takes over and the time that Aurangzeb dies. And so in the last 7 years, in any case, the Marathas had taken over. So this is all forgotten. And it is now, why has it been written out? The Marxists, led by a man called Nurul Hasan, education minister of Indira Gandhi in the 1970s, he was a Muslim Marxist. This is a double poison. And so this double poisonous man, he entirely rewrote Indian history, and Jadunath Sarkar, G.S.R. Desai, R.C. Majumdar, Radhakumar Mukherjee, they were all written out. They were entirely censored. Their books could not be found. This is remarkable because the original project of rewriting Indian history from an Indian perspective was that 11-volume work, but it was censored by the Congress during Indira Gandhi's phase of being a vassal of the Soviet Union. Please read the Mitrokhin archives. She had become a vassal of the Soviet Union, in effect, the CPI and so on. And this guy, Nurul Hasan, was a representative of that. He was a Marxist. He was a CPI. He was basically a communist ideologue who had been made education minister of the whole of India. And he basically rewrote particularly the Maratha period, because it was, now, Shivaji established a Hindavi Swaraj. The idea of Swaraj, which Tilak then took on, was first formulated by Shivaji, and the Marathas lived by that throughout. So, we really need to re-excavate and relearn about the Marathas. Thank you.
I'm going to go to Vijayji now, and I'm going to ask her about how this narrative change was something that she discovered while doing research for her work.
Namaskar. Can you hear me? We have historians, and some of the people I referred to, in fact, are here. So on history at all. But what I would like to speak about is about how these narratives culturally affected us. My book is based in Varanasi, and the timeline is when Aurangzeb destroyed Kashi Vishwanath. And I would like to speak about what my connect was to Varanasi, in fact. I remember, I think it was somewhere in 2001 when the Mahakumbh took place, the one that happens once in 144 years. I don't know what really got into me, and I suddenly wanted to go to Varanasi. But being from down south, what is it we feel about this whole event of the Kumbh or Varanasi? Oh, you want to go to Varanasi? Are you crazy? Was the first thing I was asked. I said, why? Oh, you know what the Kumbh is about? It's about these chillum smoking, people who are high on drugs, these guys, this is how I suppose, these guys who are walking around naked. The whole picture was such a, it was like a shock to me. I said, what do you mean? I said, I want to go, because I was consumed by wanting to go. And my experience is beyond words. It was just such a beautiful experience. Yes, there are crowds. Yes, millions of people there. But the whole concept of Varanasi is so beautiful. From when I went to now, probably physically the place is much cleaned up. But culturally, that was a place of learning. But how much do we ever read about any of that, save for ones who are actually academically wanting to learn? So any of these topics, like he was talking about R.C. Majumdar's book, only because I wanted to do some exams, I even bought R.C. Majumdar's books. But otherwise, the normal person who reads our history books, we simply do not like ourselves. We wake up each morning not liking ourselves or anything about ourselves. You speak of Ayurveda, oh, it's a backward something. It's not scientifically tested. You speak of, oh, our dharma is all just rituals. But nobody ever thinks beyond that, because we are so consumed by the narratives that are thrown around about us. So when I looked at it, I said I need to write something that will go beyond the narratives. But at first, if I have to tell you the truth, I wrote without even thinking. I wrote without wanting to write. But I guess what I had read as just a normal person, if you look at the history books, 13 chapters are about Mughals. You just touch upon the Marathas. And there's a passing mention of the Vijayanagar kingdom. Otherwise, I still remember one line about Aurangzeb. Aurangzeb was a great statesperson. And for some reason, the Hindus didn't like him. This is what you feed to children, and this is what has been fed. Even today, if you look at some academic articles coming out of some other universities across the world, I read one about what a great person Aurangzeb was and how wrong we are in saying anything else about Aurangzeb. So, these narratives definitely affect our Indian psyche. We have grown up disliking ourselves, and you always read about this one traitor, that's why we lost the battle. Who read about Durgavati? Nobody reads about Durgavati. Amar Chitra Kathas have somewhere touched upon some of them. And unless you want to take it further, that's all you know about it. And we are a country who thinks arts, the art subjects, the social subjects are all of not much consequence. For us, it's all about science and mathematics, and otherwise you're stupid. In fact, I think I was the first in our whole family to even take arts. And I was always looked at like, oh, she can't do accounts. I mean, forget about it. She's an art student. But somewhere our history, and now when I wrote this book, everybody asked me, oh, you've written about Aurangzeb. I said, okay, so what? I said, I've hardly written much about it historically in that sense. Oh, no. Why should you write? Why should you rake up history? I said, history is not to rake up anything. History is to actually start understanding what has happened to us. I said, we need to know. I said, and why did such things happen? Because we do not accept diversity. If Aurangzeb destroyed, if every one of them destroyed, it's because they do not accept diversity. They do not accept that there's another way to achieve whatever you want to achieve in life. We have these blinkers, it's my way or the highway. If you don't listen, you're out, the sword is out. The others brought it through our back, and these, directly. So my whole work, my whole thought process was about how do we culturally start liking ourselves. So reading all this started opening my eyes to saying, let me write something that's very simple, where we actually like ourselves and where we are very, very proud of what we have and we want to protect what we have. It has nothing to do with being against anybody. It's to accept that there are a lot of ways of living. And in fact, the protagonists in my story start with young children and the way they've been raised. It's just a weaver's family. We all read about kings and queens and etc. I said, let me write about what the commoners felt. How that went for us. So, another thing I love to think about is when I talk of Ayurveda, everybody tells me go to a real doctor. Because down the ages, even Hindi movies, what do we see? What have we seen when we were children? There'll be an epidemic in a village and there'll become this Vaidya with that stupid plait going around with the flower in the end. I mean, an absolute incompoop who doesn't know anything about the medicine or the body. And the whole village will be, dying. And then will come this white-collared doctor who will come and cure everybody. So this is what has indirectly gone into our psyche. And then the constant refrain about it's not scientific, it's not scientific. There's a Sanskrit book called Kshema Kutuhalam, which is recipes from the 10th century. It also speaks about the qualities that a cook should have. So they say that a cook should be somebody who's almost like a doctor. When they cook, they should know whom they're cooking for and how they should cook, what the ingredients are about. And just one example of how to cook, I think it was the pumpkin. So the way they come to a conclusion of how pumpkin is good, they cook it in different vessels, right? From the earthen pot to the gold pot. And the wood that they use, from mango wood to every variety of wood in different seasons. Then it's fed to people of different stages in life. young, old, pregnant, sick, etc., etc., and then they come to a conclusion. If this is not scientific, then what is science? Is it only something that comes out of a laboratory? So we are constantly, these are all things that just make us dislike everything about ourselves. And when we speak of ritual, of course, anything that is done without meaning or understanding is just blind. And what are we told? Oh, you worship these idols. Even that very word idol kind of disturbs me. It's a symbol, it's a deity. For us, we brought it in. We are a people who can worship in a temple, we can worship at a havan, we can worship the Akasha, Vayu, Agni, Apa, Prithvi. We can just sit down and close our eyes. For us, because I always remember what Swami Dayananda Saraswati said, we are not a one God religion. We are an only God people. For us, the entire creation is divine. So these are a lot of things that made me think. I said, how do we get this across to anybody? Because, and then, it's always that I will take movies because they are the ones that the majority population watch. So always the Good Samaritan is either a church or a mosque. And people never speak about the amount that people of Sanatana Dharma do. In fact, the one basis of Sanatana Dharma, a framework, is called the Panchamahayagnas. Yajna is not, the moment we say yajna, we all, conjure up a fire altar and, pouring ghee into that. Yajna is an action. So there's what is called the Panchamahayagna. The Panchamahayagna starts with Deva Yajna. When we say worship, it's not literally only the worship. Yeah? Okay, 2 minutes. The Panchamahayagna speaks about Deva Yajna, that is worship. When I say worship, it's not about just, offering flowers is also beautiful, but it's respect. So, Akasha, Vayu, Agni, Apa, Prithvi, the elements. When we say we have to worship the elements, we have to pay respect, then we don't pollute. And when we don't pollute, who are we helping? Ourselves. If you have clean water, you're helping yourself. So, that framework is for ourselves. So when we worship the elements, it's called Deva Yajna. Then we have what is called Pitru Yajna, taking forward the legacy of what was left for us, which is our heritage and culture. And then you have what is called Bhuta Yajna, which is anything other than man. So you support the entire creation. Putting kolam, where I'm just saying one of the examples, where the ants and insects eat, feeding the cows, feeding everything. And then you have Manusha Yajna or community service. And then the last is the Brahma Yajna, which is paying respect to those who have given us knowledge. So what do? We keep a Ramayana book or Mahabharata book, put 2 flowers and it's all done. But if you actually open and you actually read, just one thing from the Ramayana where Rama is told, even the king, when he rules, it's not ruling, it's service. That's the attitude that has to be there. So this is the framework of Sanatana Dharma. If only we followed that, we wouldn't have to be disliking ourselves. So we have environmental awareness, we have community service, and these are all what we have been told to do. But have we heard about it? No. Do we do it? Maybe. I'm not saying that we all don't do it. But are we proud of what we have? No. So that's what I got from all the research that I did. Thank you.
Thank you, Vijayji. I'm going to open the floor to questions.
Namaskaram. My question is to all the panelists there.
Just speak into the mic, please.
My question is to all the panelists here. It reminded me of an incident wherein I was talking to young people straight out of college, age group 18 to 21, wherein I mentioned an incident of why people keep their children name as Taimur. And they are Hindu girls. And they said, what is the problem? She kept the name, what is the problem? And I was explaining to them that they might not know who is Taimur, and because of that ignorance they're okay with it. Even after explaining it, they were like, we don't mind it, and they're from Hindu culture, young girls. Second incidence is like it's a pattern in North India.
Just keep the question short.
So I want to understand that in the generation of young minds, how do such information can impact, and how can we change the cultural ignorance or specifically to the young minds and to people who do not know the facts, and even after knowing the facts, how do we make an impact of cultural change?
Disha, maybe you should take this because you're the archaeologist here. Talk a little bit about how you make maybe actual history sexy, archaeology sexy.
I'll take the second question because I work in the time period which is quite back in antiquity. So I'll talk about the wrong narrative being fed the young generation. Now, when we talk about narratives, there are two types of narratives. The way I look at it, I mean, it's my personal way of looking at it. One is the academic narrative, which goes into research and academic research. One is a popular narrative, which goes beyond just academic research, right? And I deal with it because I do public archaeology. When I write columns, the comments and the kind of notes that I get or any discussion, I do see this two difference, right? So academically, when there are narratives set, only more research, and I think the panelists have discussed about it, more research into the unknown can only solve that problem, right? Unless and until you go and you excavate the questions or the places which have not been explored, you will not find the answer. The only way to find the answer is to do more exploration in any which way, in any form that your work requires. The second is a popular narrative. It will only be erased when academics start talking and have a discussion on the public forum. And I think with archaeology, it requires, because you will find historians talking, from all, talking from Marathas to Mughals to East India Company and different parts of history or medieval history actually. But with archaeology, you will find very limited number of archaeologists who deal right from 1.7 million years all the way to 21st century. So I think the discourse like this, and slowly and steadily, when there is more discussions, more public conversations, only then can it erase. And when I am dealing with the younger lot who comes to me for training every year, we have these questions, and as a mentor, as a trainer, my job is to keep calm and repeat same thing again and again. So I think it's multifaceted. There's not one way.
Keep Bollywood out of this. Sorry about that, but let's stick to history.
I want to ask another question to Disha Ahluwalia. It was a fascinating survey which you did of the recent findings in Indian archaeology. And it's quite evident that that's actually transformed the way in which we've looked at our past. Now, considering that archaeology as a discipline has more or less is dying in Indian universities, and it's in a pathetic condition. Yes. And you probably know it much better than I do. how is this knowledge getting transmitted into the more popular or even the academic discourses on Indian history? Is there a huge time lag which is now taking place, or is this being confined strictly to the professional archaeologists and not getting transmitted elsewhere? And if not, then what can we do to narrow the gap as much as possible?
There is a huge vacuum. There's a huge vacuum. As an archaeologist, when we are discussing it in conferences, it doesn't seem like that, because everything is interlinked. And also now archaeology is more scientifically leaning more than historical. There are reasons for it. And when we have discourses and conferences, we don't feel like it. But when I or anyone try and discuss archaeology with the public, in public discourse, or do public archaeology, I find a huge vacuum, not just with archaeologists and people, but historians and archaeologists too, right? And there is the gap, I think, is because neither of them are willing to initiate a conversation, and also not willing to understand how the methodology works. Because archaeologists don't necessarily work like an historian. The methodology is very different. And as a field archaeologist, I can tell you, we don't go with, thinking a certain way. Our idea is to dig. Our idea is into, documenting an artifact in the context, and then building a hypothesis comes much later, right? And historically, a historian works in a different way. There are different ways of working, but there is no interconnection. Historian and archaeologists come on the same forum only when they have to talk about historical sites, right? Historical sites which we all know, and the histories are written as well as you can excavate. But going beyond, there is this huge disconnect between the people and also between archaeologists and historians. And yes, universities, the departments are dying because there is no funding also. If I go to get funding, because I have tried to get fundings multiple times, I don't get funding. From culture sector, I can't get funding that easily. My research is funded by ICHR, but I can tell you the funding was a little difficult. I have to now go and get funding from scientific, more scientific leaning, foundations which fund more scientific leaning work, right? So the reason why departments are dying is because there is lack of funding also. That is also one of the reasons why. And also because there is a lack of motivation to be an archaeologist, because there's not much economic benefit coming. A young scholar, I get numerous messages, DMs and emails by students who are in 11th, 10th, 12th standard. They want to pursue archaeology. They often ask me, how much does an archaeologist get paid? And I was a student, in my second, third year, my professor told me that if you want to be an archaeologist, marry a rich man. No, I'm an archaeologist, married, but I'm on my own. I just got married, but that's besides the point. So that sort of motivation you get at a very early level. So that is the reason why I think we need to motivate and fund archaeology within the culture sector also. Maybe look at the mighty Stone Age dwellers and stone tool makers also once in a while.
There's some more
Can
questions.
I go ahead?
Lots of questions. Yes, please.
Please.
Keep it short, please, so that we can accommodate more
Sure.
questions.
Sure. Half my question was already asked by Shri Supanji. I'll contextualize it.
Yeah. Please keep it short. 30-second questions, please.
Is that also the reason why the Sanori chariot related dating and Saraswati River Paleo Channel related dating is not flowing back into history? Because the historians are acting as though these two things don't exist at all. And
Yeah.
Yeah, true. See, the chariots, the date that we got the chariot, we have a scientific date. Now, stratigraphy is how we work, right? There are different stratas and layers. The chariot, the context the chariot belongs to, there were multiple pots in the same context, and the grains from one of the pots were dated. And the date goes to about 1900, the bracket, because there are range of C14 dates. You don't get one date, right? So the range is from 2000 to 1800. So we have scientific dates. It's not a tentatively or relatively dated thing. Paleo channel is also scientifically dated. In fact, at Rakhigadi, for Drishyatavati, because the river, the Paleo channel as to how it turned around Rakhigadi was not known. So this year with GSI, Geological Survey of India, we try to trace with remote sensing also, and we try to trace that channel, and now we know the dates. The dating of the channel is scientifically known. You will find multiple dates and scientific evidence published by geologists. Amazing work done. We now know that from Ghaggar it was flowing all the way to Kutch. So there is no denying that the river didn't exist. Why certain historians don't want to believe is because they don't want to accept scientific data. It's all scientific. I'm not saying that because of some belief. So I don't know, geologists have done amazing work in tracing the river, and hopefully we'll get the dates also, more dates from coming excavations.
Okay, very, very brief, please. Can you speak into the mic?
Yeah, 30-second input. I'll postpone the question to tea time. Relates to the Marathas and what Prasenjit said. Yes, the Navy has an INS Angre right after independence. We have an INS Shivaji. We have an INS Tanaji. The Coast Guard has a Coast Guard ship Tarabai. And just to tell you, these are long series of initiatives. But the most recent one is that this year on the 4th of December, the Indian Navy is celebrating the Navy Day of Sindhudurg with her operational demonstration to commemorate, amongst other things, the 350th year of the ascension to throne of Shivaji. Thank you.
So, I have a question to Disha. Basically, what are because the biggest challenge
is short.
Yeah. The biggest challenge, especially with regards to finding sites, is if someone, let's say a farmer or somebody in a rural area, they find that there is a mound or they find some artifact, will they report it back to you? Are there any strong incentive schemes? Or because sometimes I've noticed people feel that, it can be difficult if you kind of point out that this is a place of historical
importance. So, I think today the dying of archaeology is also correlated to dying of many sites. Okay, so many sites have been flattened to accommodate settlements. So today the challenge is totally different as it was way back when there was more land available for exploration. Like in case of Sonali, there is not a mound; it's a flat. Sugarcane cultivation happens on the site. So the farmer, when they was tilling the land, he found copper artifacts. And then there was some unauthorized digging happen, and then the authorities got to know. But in most cases, where there is settlement, like in Rakhigadi, so mound number 4 and 5 of Rakhigadi, this modern settlement, people usually don't alter the contour of the archaeological site. So if a site is like this uphill sort of a thing, they will build a settlement along the contour, if it's a settlement. But if it's for agriculture, they have to flatten it. They have to dig deeper till they reach the natural soil. So imagine from above the ground, if the site is about 10, 11 meters and below the ground level, it's about 7. They have to dig about 7 meters and only then. So the section is found and then how we get the site. And then we have data also.
Okay, so we've completely run out of time. Thank you very much. This was a most engaging session. I hope you enjoyed it. And a humble request from all of us, do read history for fun.